Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kendra. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion. The focus of this is to explore career paths that have to do with trauma in the populations as well, affiliated with that. I'm a second-year MSW international student at Silver, and we'll go right ahead and start with the introduction of our panelists.
Hi, I'm Marisol Lado. I'm a social worker with the Department of Veterans Affairs, Secaucus Vet Center. I work in the readjustment counseling services portion of the VA, where we only treat combat veterans, and we primarily treat PTSD, MST, which is military sexual trauma, and TBI and their families as well. I graduated from NYU in 2007, and I've been in the field for quite a while with veterans.
My name is Sarah Person. I'm a senior clinical social worker and supervisor at the Safe Horizon Counseling Center. Safe Horizon our counseling center treats crime victims, victims of domestic violence, incest, rape. We treat everyone from infants to adults. And I also am going to be heading up a project there where we're going to be putting satellite counseling sensors into our DV shelters. I also have a part-time private practice, which is not as trauma-oriented, and I graduated in 2007. I had a whole other career before I became a social worker as a writer, and so I feel very fortunate that I got to do this.
Thank you. So the format will go, I'll just ask the panelists a few questions, and then at the end, if you guys have any follow-up questions, want to inquire further about what you can do, more about what they do, raise your hand, and I'll select you. All right, so our first question, did you know you wanted to pursue social work school, and how did you come to determine your career path? And I think Sarah kind of alluded to a shift, so maybe you could start.
I was a writer for 25 years, and around 9/11, I decided that I majored undergraduate in psychology, but when I was in my 20s, I really didn't feel like I could help anyone figure anything out. So I was a writer, which doesn't require you to do that. And around 9/11, I decided I didn't want to write about things anymore. I wanted to do things, and I wanted to do things one-on-one. And so I knew that I wanted to be a therapist. That I knew, but I had no idea that I would end up in trauma or anything like that.
I was actually pre-law in undergrad, and then I took an Intro to Social Services course that opened the doors to social work because the professor was an LCSW. And I realized just in that class that I wanted to be on the other end of helping the persons that were being traumatized or having difficulties or part of being victims. So that was my shift towards social services. And after that, I just knew I wanted to be a social worker and applied, and here I am. Working with veterans, as far as working with trauma, my husband's a Marine, so I was always part of the military culture, 12 years. So I had always kind of knew that that's where I wanted to go. And when I lived in Virginia for a while. I worked in a hospital there. And being that it's close proximity to a military base, there was a lot of veterans coming into the hospital. And that's when I really realized that this is the population I want to work with, and eventually move towards the VA.
How did both of you or either of you decide NYU? Like, what did NYU have to offer that seemed along the lines of, because both of you had career shifts, so why NYU for social work?
Well, I applied to several schools, but NYU, because I wanted to be a therapist, NYU's clinical orientation really appealed to me. The location appealed to me. I live in Brooklyn. I wasn't really big on going all the way up to the Upper East Side to go to school, and I was fortunate to get some money to come here, so that really just sealed the deal. But NYU was really always my first choice.
Same here. NYU was my first choice too because of the clinical piece. That's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to do clinical work, so this was just the best option, and it was close to home too.
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
All right. So, what are some important areas of study that you have felt helped to build expertise in terms of treating and working with trauma? You can go ahead, Marisol.
I mean, when dealing with PTSD with combat veterans, there's so much going on, so a constant training is necessary. I'm constantly going to trainings, constantly going to conferences. I'm actually heading next week to Harvard for an anxiety conference. So it's, you always have to be reaching out. I'm constantly reading military books. I have a list of books that I've read already and continue to read because it's always changing. Our field is always changing. The VA also has a lot of intranet sites that allow us to communicate nationwide to other readjustment counseling services where we can communicate. So that's a good resource once you're with the VA.
Part of when I graduated from NYU, I did a week-long seminar at the Cape Cod Institute. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They do on Cape Cod fabulous week-long trainings in a lot of psychotherapy-related issues, and I went to one with Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the foremost researchers and practitioners in the field of trauma, and it just really blew me away. And I think that one of the things that's so exciting about the field of trauma right now is that there are so many different modalities and subject areas that impact the work right now. So, for example, advances in neuroscience, understanding how the brain works, understanding how you can repair damage in the brain, both the physiological and the emotional and the cognitive repair of it. There's so many different aspects of that are all coming together right now. There's also a lot of body-oriented work. I'm in the second year of training of sensory motor psychotherapy, which is a body-oriented treatment for trauma and also attachment and development issues. Cognitive behavioral therapy, we several of our modalities in the clinic involve cognitive behavioral therapy. Attachment, which was always like a really fascinating area to me. All these things come together in the treatment of trauma in what I do. It's probably different for the military. So I went to while I was in social work school and after I was in social work school, I kept up to date on workshops in the city. Institutes sponsor them all the time. It's a great way to get information and to be exposed to really prominent thinkers and practitioners in the field. Books, but I think it's a really fascinating time to be in trauma for all those reasons, because there are just so many different ways to work with it, and we have so much of a greater understanding than we did even 10 years ago.
Marisol, would you like to touch more on the interventions, like Sam mentioned, that you guys use as well at the VA?
The VA, we're kind of limited to what we can utilize because of the restrictions. We have to use evidence-based practice treatment modalities. So they do promote a lot of CBT, a lot of EMDR, and prolonged exposure. Everything else, we kind of do it, on our own. But documentation-wise, you got to do, CBT and all that. So that's majority of what the VA wants us to be utilizing right now, working with veterans. And even to do CBT, if you are not trained within the VA and you have outside training, they don't transfer it over. It has to be trained within the VA. So a lot of rules go on with that, working with the VA and treating the veterans.
Well, during the course of your MSW program or studies, was there a particular class or professor that helped prompted you towards trauma focus or helped to inform the work that you do now?
I had plenty of professors that informed the work I do now, but when I was here, there was not a class in trauma. Not one. So I got a lot of that on the outside. But there are people, a lot of them are gone now, unfortunately, but Jeff Seinfeld and Ida Goldstein, Martha Gabriel was a wonderful professor of mine. But trauma, I had to go outside a lot to find what I was interested in.
When I was my first year, my internship was with YCS, with working with traumatized children in the foster home settings. And then my second year was working with trauma refugees in the International Institute of New Jersey. So I got a little bit of trauma while I was there, while I was here. didn't have any classes that were necessarily offered specifically on trauma, but the experience I gained during my internships was helpful. I did recognize that working with children wasn't something I was ready to do with trauma, but it definitely gave me a good foundation when I graduated.
Can I just add something also when you talk about, I was very fortunate that I had 2 outpatient mental health internships in regular mental health clinics, but what I found is that 80% of people who come through a regular mental health clinic have some kind of trauma. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of early on where I started to see, like, you really you have to know about it. I mean, the amount of childhood sexual abuse, the amount of domestic violence, you get that anywhere. So.
We're talking about the field and practice and internship. What are surprising things that have come up in your practice or at your internships, good and bad?
Well, with my internship, like I said, I knew I didn't want to work, but not that I didn't want to. It was very difficult as an intern working with the traumatized children. I didn't feel ready for that, but I did well. I did finish. But working with combat veterans, I have learned a lot of new things. I mean, I'm a military spouse, and I've gone through the deployments. I've seen people, get killed in action, not seen, but around me, the bereavements, and my children had to stay home. Like, I've had that other end experience, but being part on the clinician side and actually helping veterans and their families and hearing their trauma, the most surprising thing I've had is that I feel more anxious myself more often. I never was good at watching scary movies or anything like that. Now I really don't watch them. I just can't. I get my anxiety builds up. And we recognize that in the office, that everyone's kind of more anxious in our field when hearing trauma every day. We see about 4 or 5 clients on average a day, so it can become pretty intense. The other surprising thing with the combat veteran community is I always knew there was a stigma, and I'm sure most of you know that there's a stigma with PTSD with combat veterans, but being part of the actual process, you realize that stigma is really, really damaging, and it's very, very true. These soldiers and airmen and Marines do lose their jobs, once they have that PTSD label. And as a therapist, a social worker, you kind of struggle. Well, do I give you the diagnosis, but then you lose your job and your family financially struggles? Like, what do I do now? So that was probably one of the most surprising things that I've encountered, that this stigma is very, very real to a lot of people, and we can do a lot of damage by giving them the PTSD diagnosis.
The good first. I think what I found for me is that doing work with trauma is enormously gratifying. To be able to take someone from such deep pain that has really, that is impacting every area of their life, and be able to help them heal, to be able to work with young children when they're young, before they become adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse or something, but when it's actually happening, and to be able for them to regain their lives and go on without that, is really gratifying. Trauma work, though, and Marisol alluded to that, it's really, really hard. It really, really takes a lot out of you. My supervisor describes it as there's a burning building. Everybody runs away from a burning building, but the firemen run into it. And that's kind of what trauma work is like. Mm-hmm. So it take what we call it vicarious trauma. Mm-hmm. So when you sit there and you listen all day long to this, it will change your life. Mm-hmm. It will change your outlook if you're really, in it, doing the work. And it's hard for me to sit here and say how that's going to impact your life, but I can say that it will. And sometimes it's a high price. For some people, it's too high of a price. I mean, it's one thing to know that the world has a lot of bad people in it and bad things happen. It's another thing to be in there with them every day. And it can alter your worldview. It can make you anxious. It can make you kind of jumpier. It impacted some of my global beliefs about the world, and about my faith. and things like that, to just see kind of the horrors that are really perpetrated on people. But having said that, it's really amazing work to do. And I am very lucky, and maybe you are too, that I work in an incredibly supportive environment with lots of training, lots of supervision, lots of support. I don't think you can't really do the work without that. If you ever find yourself in a situation and you're doing the work without that, find someplace else because you really, it makes all the difference.
You both allude to the difficulty of working with trauma, and I was going to go to, you always jump the gun, Sarah. But, more about where you guys go to for advice and consultation, and also what you do. I know, I can't remember her last name, Laura, Trauma Stewardship is a good book talking about taking care of oneself. But besides, reading books, what other things can people that work in the trauma field do?
I'm working with RCS at the Vet Center, where it's kind of like a private practice almost. We all have our own individual offices. We're a small little clinic. We have about 6 counselors, and that's pretty average nationwide for the vet centers. So we all just kind of keep crossing over into everyone's office when you have a difficult, session, and you debrief, and everyone's readily available to help you there. But formally, we do meet once a week as case conference on Mondays, and then we every other week we actually have a consultant come in as well. So we do have formal case conference, and for the military sexual trauma piece, there's an online forum where all RCS nationwide get to communicate. You email in a secure network your current case that you're finding difficulty with, and you get a load of information of people responding to it. We're trying to get that for the PTSD aspect, but right now it's only available for MST. But there's so much availability of the clinicians working within our program, and we all kind of know, what's happening with us, what's happening with the client, and how else we can help each other and the veteran that's in front of us.
In addition to the support I get at Safe Horizon, I also have a supervisor for my private practice. I talk to other colleagues that I aren't at Safe Horizon. I am in a group of newer psychotherapists, so we meet 3-4 times a year and share all kinds of information, practice information too. I think it's great to have a hobby. It's great to have things that you like to do, really, outside of the work, because that helps a lot. I swim. That keeps me helps keep me really balanced. I go out of the city, anywhere, just to be where it's quieter. Over time, you learn what works for you. I do, some mindfulness and meditation and things like that. You have trauma really pushes you to take care of yourself.
In terms of additional support, are there other professional organizations or institutions that you guys formalized that you guys have joined since going into trauma work or even social work?
National Institute of Trauma, again, it's all within the VA. I'm not even sure if it's open to the public. We have our own research that's being done within the VA, and it gets distributed to us constantly. The DoD has its own Center of Deployment Psychology. That's an open site, I know that, and it's a really good resource for working with veterans. And they actually have a certificate program once you have your MSW as well. That's really good if that's what you'd like to do. The NASW the deployment of military psychology. They actually have an MSW postgrad certificate at Drexel University, I think, in Philadelphia. Yeah. So that's available, and they had a great resource online as well to get information. The VA has, if you ever get an opportunity to work with the VA, it has a plethora of information on their websites, intranets, within our own program. It's always available to us. And we have all the newest PTSD information sent through us via email every morning. Anything that's written about PTSD and veterans gets sent to us every morning through an email newsletter list that somebody, I don't even know how they do it, but I just get a whole bunch of email articles every morning. So.
I am a member of the NASW. I'm not a big joiner of lots of organizations, but I have found NASW to be very helpful with their workshops that they offer, and I've done quite a few of them. There's also an organization, it's nctsn.org, that is the National Child Trauma something, and there's a wealth of information there on children trauma research, current research, different training modalities. We also only use evidence-based treatments in our clinic as well.
And NASW just released a working with military and veterans course as well. I believe it's free online that you take it and you get a certificate at the end. The VA had a big input on that, putting that together, and I believe it's just out recently this summer. So if anyone's interested in that, it is available on NASW.
I also think, for me, I'm doing the sensory motor training. I think in any field of work, you just constantly want to be going and train, getting more information, finding new ways to work with people, so my sensory motor training has been formed also a very supportive community. Just being with other people who are doing the work is really, really helpful.
Are there any specific courses or training that you guys would suggest to other persons interested in trauma work to take?
I mean, working with trauma, as Sarah's already said, you're dealing with a host of symptoms all kind of balled up into one. Like right now, I'm actually in the NYU postgrad clinical addictions program because we're seeing an increase of veterans coming with addictions, trying to cope with their trauma. Mm-hmm. So it is important to keep up to date with all the new treatments and modalities. EMDR is something that's up and coming, and the VA loves EMDR. I myself am not trained in EMDR. Eye movement, it's the eye when you do this. The eye movement
desensitization, and
and what it does is, for some reason, this bilateral movement, when you work with somebody, can take them to a very deep memory.
Yeah, I think
so it's
Shapiro.
Yeah, Shapiro. Yeah, you have to definitely be trained to do that because you can actually cause damage to a person and their trauma and their memory. So, we have one clinician in our vet center who's trained to do it, and he takes that on if anyone specifically requests that. Mm-hmm. Treating anxiety is what I'm going to next week at Harvard Medical School. They're all anxious. They all deal with anxiety. Anger management, actually, with SAMHSA, I utilize their book with my veterans for working with anger management, and I teach the anger management courses. And all that actually comes, the anger management, all that comes once the veteran's able to even process their trauma. Then it's like, okay, let's work on how you've been coping for all these years, But the Cape Cod Institute is great. Vester Vandercoat actually does one every summer. They're really, really good trainings with Vester Vandercoat and the Cape Cod Institute.
And there's lots of people there. The woman who runs my program, Pat Ogden, is there, and Janina Fisher. And if you've ever heard of internal family systems, mm-hmm. Richard Schwartz, which is parts work for trauma, working with different parts of the self mm-hmm. to deal with trauma.
And if you're specifically interested in working with the veterans, the Center of Military Psychology, the Bethesda Walter Reed Medical Center, they offer courses as well, working with veterans with PTSD and TBI. Trying to think what Rutgers actually offers courses working with military population and their trauma as well, and they also have a trauma certificate, a crisis and trauma certificate program too.
ICP has a trauma program, and also NIP, National Institute for Psychotherapies, have trauma programs, and they very often do workshops. I was just at one at NIP a few weeks ago. I know that NYU does now offer mm-hmm. adult survivors of sexual abuse with Miriam Habib, and I would strongly urge you, if you're interested, she's fabulous, to take that class.
So, one more question before we open up
Sure.
for others from the floor. What are some pieces of advice that you would give students graduating from the MSW program and eventually want to work in the trauma field, broadly? Yeah.
get your license as soon as you can. Don't put it off, because you're going to need it almost anywhere you want to work. The question was, want to work where I work.
Let's say both. Generally, you want to work in trauma, and then specifically where you are.
In trauma, I would say read and go to workshops and do as much as you can to familiarize yourself. Do people understand like trauma in terms of what we're talking about? Is that like clear? And PTSD? I realize we've been talking. If you need a little more amplification on that, I'm happy to do it. Yeah, okay. Because I just realized. Well, we both work with post-traumatic stress disorder, okay? And also, somebody may not have full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. They may have an anxiety disorder. They may have something related to that. But basically, trauma, the definition of trauma, right, is something that happens in your life that is so far outside of your expected experience that it's really kind of a shattering kind of experience, okay? And it impacts the clusters of symptoms are avoidance. One is that something horrible happened to me and I absolutely don't want to deal with it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it, right? And then at the same time, there are all these intrusive symptoms, which is that I can't stop thinking about it. I'm having nightmares. I'm having flashbacks. It's coming at me all the time. And then the third category of symptoms is hypervigilance or hyperarousal, which is like the body's always on alert, right? Something happened, you went into, high crisis mode, and your body has actually never come back down from that. And so people constantly feel racy, jittery, can't sleep, all these kinds of things. And so that's sort of the basic framework for what PTSD and trauma is. So
then touch on what advice you would give to students about working in trauma generally, and then specifically steps they can make if they want to work with children in trauma.
With children in trauma.
Yeah.
I think mostly what you need is training. I need to think that you need to get as much training as you can. We work, and I'm sure you work also, we work, the way that we work is very trauma-focused therapy. So, for example, in some clinics where they're not trauma-focused, you come in and you've been, God forbid, raped or whatever, but first they're going to go into your family and your history and your background and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and maybe 6 months down the road, you might start going for the rape, right? In what we do, we go for the trauma because everything else is related to the trauma. Mm-hmm. The trauma is where it all starts. And we say that, trauma symptoms are actually adaptations to really intolerable pain. I absolutely did not want to work with children. I was like, no way. And when I got to Safe Horizon, they were like, too bad, you're going to do it. And now I find it really gratifying. I think, going to conferences, that there are many, many of them. There's an annual trauma conference in Boston, run by Bessel van der Kolk. It's the International Conference on Trauma. It's in June. It's fantastic. It's usually all the foremost people in the field at that time. And at Safe Horizon, actually in the counseling center, we are not looking for people that are highly, highly trained, because we train everybody when they come. So we train them in 4 different modalities of treatment, to work with infants, to work with PTSD and substance abuse, children, and adults. And so we're actually not as psychodynamically oriented.
Specifically working where I work at the VA or with RCS, our Readjustment Counseling Services, Department of Defense, or working with military and veterans, if you are not a veteran or military yourself or not a family member and you're not aware of the culture, the best thing I would say is get an internship with the Readjustment Counseling Services or the VA or whichever Department of Defense program you'd like. Because usually, majority of the people that work at our programs are veterans themselves or someone related to a veteran. Like I'm a military spouse, so I know the culture. You have to know the culture, you have to know the lingo, you have to know the terminology. I mean, even the way we put in our sessions on the computer is by military time. So you need to know all of that before you can actually come in. And when you come in, it's kind of like baptized by fire. No one has time to really sit down and show you the computer program. So it's best to be an intern to come in and get that training in advance. So after that, chances of you getting hired are very, very high. Anyone else that's not military related in our vet center have all been interns. Mm-hmm. And this is in every other vet center in our region and nationwide too. So it's not too often we hear of someone that did an intern or doesn't know the military culture already that's working at a vet center. Mm-hmm.
Broadly, what advice?
Working with trauma, if that's where you want to go, you want to check in if that's where you want to go, I would recommend reading some books. Frankl has that book, The Meaning of a Man, which is a really, really good book about trauma. Working with veterans, The War and the Soul is another good book. And The War and the Soul. Yeah, that's a really, really good book about working with veterans and their trauma. Also, I could give you two more if you guys that's my thing. I like to read. Tim O'Brien has What It's Like to Go to War and the Things They Carried. Those are excellent, excellent books for if anyone's interested in working with veterans or should, read if they want to work with veterans. Mm-hmm. As far as, working just generally with trauma, I would say definitely check in on all your own stuff. I think that's the most important thing I did while I was at my MSW program, that I got the knowledge and education to kind of realize maybe there's something I need to work on myself, because you can have all the right information and all the tools that you need to help your client, but if you haven't worked on it on your own, the delivery is not going to be there and you may cause more damage. When you're talking about a trauma victim, they're so fragile and they're so already kind of, don't trust you. So if you come in with your own stuff that hasn't been figured out yet, it can really cause the damage and you won't be able to help that veteran or client, the best way possible. And I've seen it happen where, you want to help them, you have good intentions, but that driving force is coming within you. And it's something that I feel that people should really, really do their best to kind of contain, hold on to it, go talk to, your coworker or your supervisor and say, this is kind of what's coming up for me. But if you're doing it right in session, it's, it's not good in any field, but definitely not with trauma.
I just spaced out for a second.
You want to come back to it?
No. Just
okay.
So what?
No, I mean we're just touching broadly on just advice that you give to students that graduate.
I did want to say, following up on Marisol, we do have interns at the Safe Horizon. So I think that's one of the things that you can do while you're still in school is if you're interested in trauma to, ask for a trauma placement in your.
And I know NYU does put placements at the Bloomfield Vet Center, which is our sister vet center. So,
a couple of other names that I could throw out there if you're interested in books and stuff like that. Judith Herman, the book Trauma and Recovery is one of the classics in the field. Also, John Briere, Briere. I think it's Principles of Trauma Treatment. I'm not sure about the title, but he's one of also the foremost. Anything by Bessel van der Kolk. And Dan Siegel, if you're familiar with him, has done a lot of work to bring together the neuroscience and the treatment. And he has many books out, but one that I love is called Mindsight.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
We're going to open up the floor. We have a bit of time for questions. In our first one, go ahead.
Hi, Kimberly Jones, and I'm a first year in the studies student, so foundations year, first semester. I had a question for Sarah about the advanced clinical practice program. And I was wondering, how did you get involved with that program, and what did you gain from it?
I just when I graduated, first of all, it kept me connected to NYU. I wasn't I needed to have that lifeline there, and I don't know that helped me so much with the field of trauma. It's a postgraduate certificate program that anyone can go to, but it really broadened my knowledge base about psychotherapy, about object relations, about how to treat depression. And when I took it, there were 3 or 4 professors doing it, so it was like a fabulous way to get a little bit of the best of the best.
Yeah.
You know, it was really great, and it also helped me formulate cases. Sure.
Anyone
I have a
else?
question for Marisol. Being someone who's a military spouse and also working with veterans, what has the experience been like having work and then work at home too?
Very draining. My husband's actually injured in Iraq, so he too has PTSD and he's in a wheelchair. So I have my work around me all the time, but I can say I'm used to it. You know, I do feel like I'm in a constant cycle of military life. We don't live on a base anymore. We don't live close to a base anymore. But, you know, going into work, I feel like I enter the military every time. You know, there's unspoken rules that everyone follows, how you greet people, how you talk to people. It's a culture within, you know, our own culture. So it can be draining. It can be difficult. And on top of it, my husband's also a center counselor in Queens. So we also talk about region stuff at home. But we've learned to kind of manage that and say, you know what, home is home and let's leave it there. But, I mean, we go to the doctors at the VA hospital. You know? So it is kind of draining, but it doesn't bother me because I do enjoy working with the military. And the veterans I have found are the most gracious population I have ever worked with. I mean, they're so gracious when you're helping them and they're going through their stuff, and the fact that they can talk to you. I have Vietnam veterans that come in, haven't talked about their trauma for 40 plus years. Their wife doesn't know, and they come in and they're able to talk, and they're so gracious just at the platform to be able to share their experience 40 plus years later. So that good feeling kind of keeps me going, and I don't see myself working anywhere else at this point.
May I follow up on with that in terms of like the therapy sessions? How do you think any feelings come up for you having your husband as a veteran and then working with veterans? Do you think that impacts at all what goes on in that session?
I did process that a lot with my supervisor, so I think I'm at a good place now. There were times when a veteran would come in and they would get emotional about losing a friend or talking about a trauma that happened right next to them, or themselves almost losing their life. And I get all rattled, and I start thinking about my own, husband and all. But I've done a lot of supervision on it, and I feel like I am in a good place. The only time recently that I had an actual holy crap, I don't know what to do right now, was a veteran came in who was actually in my husband's unit that witnessed my husband get injured, and I didn't know this was him. He's telling me the trauma, and I'm just like, the story sounds really, really familiar, and I had to contain myself to not let him know that this is my husband you're talking about, to kind of, remain the boundaries. And I still work with him, and we're doing good work, and, everything is fine. But initially, I was like, oh, wow, I never had this experience at all. And it rattled me for a little bit. And, I didn't know if I should share it with my husband or not, So that was a tough one. But I haven't had that happen again.
Did you ever find out that your husband was the one you talking about?
I'm sorry?
Did your client ever find out that your husband?
No, never really. And I still see him to this day, and it's never actually come up again saying that was my husband he witnessed get injured. Hasn't come up, so.
I have a question for Sarah. I want to know a little bit more about the body-centered therapy or training you are performing right now.
There are several different kinds of body-oriented trainings for trauma right now, but what I do is called sensory motor. There's another one called somatic experiencing. That's Peter Levine. There are similarities and there are differences. But the basic concept is that the body holds the memories. Okay? So if you think about it, you think about generally memories in your head, right? But really, if you think about when things happen to you, what happens to your body, the body holds the memory too, okay? And that's the most basic, and there are quite a few books written on that. And so in sensory motor psychotherapy, we work with the body. Well, the trauma training is different than the attachment and development, but with trauma, through working through the body, you can access deep emotional material without necessarily having to go through the whole story, which is what a lot of trauma treatment does do, is that as part of the treatment, you go back, you tell the story of what happened, you reconnect to the feelings that you had, and then you process them in a way that you never did at the time of the trauma. But it can be excruciating, you know. So sensory motor can sometimes bypass that to work with the body to get to the core emotion without having to go through the entire story. And then so you process it and then you integrate it, you know, through the body, but also through cognition, also through emotion. So we work on 3 levels. You know, we work on the body, cognitive, and emotional. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just wondering, generally, is trauma work a short-term intervention, or is it something that's more long and kind of, I mean, in terms of like all the different modalities like CBT, what is the time frame?
Well, it depends on the kind of trauma. So in the kind of work that we do, it's longer term. Okay, but there's a child-oriented treatment called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and that is a shorter-term treatment. But when I say shorter-term, it could take 6 months, it could take a year, but it could take 3 months. It depends on the kind of trauma. TFCBT can take 12 to 16 sessions if the trauma is a car accident, okay, or something like that. You know, something more discrete, one time, not an interpersonal trauma. With interpersonal trauma, and you know, we see people also with complex trauma, you know, with like from childhood up, then that's a very different process. But in certain cases, it can be shorter term. When you're dealing with more complex trauma or military, you know, PTSD, stuff like that, it tends to be a longer term. I think in our clinic for adults, I would say the average is 2 years, 2-3 years.
And working with the military, just like you said, it's really long term. We don't have a cap as to how long we see our clients. It's free service to them that they're entitled to for the rest of their lives. And a lot of them, you know, like the Vietnam veterans have been utilizing this service ever since it's been created. And they have support groups, you know, they attend every week. It all depends on what their needs are. I have veterans that come in for 2 years straight and they say, I need a break, but I'll be back. You know, or I have veterans that have continuously come 3 years and they're doing good every other week. They're checking in, kind of supportive counseling, and then an anniversary comes and they're right back to the beginning of their trauma. So it's constantly coming back always. Holidays is always very difficult. The day they left to their deployment is always very difficult. The day they came back to their deployment, the day their friend died, the day they got injured. So all of this always comes up and they never ever forget it. So it's something that's always ongoing. So our doors to the veterans are always forever open to them. And I haven't seen anyone do any short-term. Like, majority of it is very, very long-term, years and years of service.
Probably also contingent on the agency as
yes,
well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And insurance,
Absolutely.
whether it's short-term or long-term.
Right.
See, and we don't even cover that. All we need is a DD-214, which I don't know if anyone knows what that is. It's a discharge document for military service members stating that they were in a combat zone. So as long as you have that, that's like your ticket into our vet center, and you are entitled to the service for the rest of your life along with family.
There was a hand.
Look back here, too.
Yeah, one question from Marisol. I actually took a trauma class this past semester, and we had someone present on MST and a lot of underreported
Yes.
assaults. And I was just wondering, what your experience has been with any pushback from the military, or how you deal with people who basically feel like they're reject, I don't know, rejecting
Sorry.
by sharing their trauma.
Could you say what MST stands
Military
for?
sexual trauma.
Okay.
It's a term coined by the military and the Department of VA. It's MST. It's very much utilized within the military culture. It is definitely underreported, and more so by the males. Every vet center has a military sexual trauma therapist specialized in working with primarily the MST population. And every now and then you might get one, like I had one, in my 3 years that I've been at the vet center, I've had one MST, but majority of them go to the specialist. But we do see a lot of resistance in regards to what's going on. Even the military is not doing such a great job on battling MST. Their current program now is telling females to don't walk alone because, it's your fault that you walked alone and that happened to you. And I'm not even joking, that's their commercial that they play for the service members that are active duty right now. And when we have MST where it's in that they can still press charges and we assist or we support, we get a lot of backfire. We get, do you know that you could possibly ruin the lives of these people if she's not telling the truth? And, you still get it a lot. And we're constantly fighting for them. And there is now a women's center at the VA hospital that's fairly new that supports them. There's an MST program now at Lions VA in New Jersey where they can go into inpatient treatment to support them, but it's still, even then, not being as utilized as we know it should be. There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of just lack of support. And when it's MST, you're talking about it feeling like it's incest. These are like your brothers and sisters and your mothers and fathers doing this to you, So it's very much like incest rape.
Wow.
Shamar?
I'm going to ask Sarah, you mentioned that you work with people who have experienced child and sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about if you're working with men and boys who have that experience, and if so, what's that been like?
Yes, we do work with men and boys who've done that. And what's it like? I mean,
I know something that is not necessarily always talked about or discussed.
Right.
What are your experiences been working with men?
I think with men, the issues are there's always shame involved with abuse and that, but I think that with men, there's another layer culturally, of like, I should never have allowed, it's like my manhood has been challenged in this. And so working with men is you have to go very, very gently, gingerly, carefully hold somebody while you also do the work, kind of make it safe and okay that this is a place where you can talk about this. I think with, but then the work becomes very similar to working with a woman. Mm-hmm. I think that's the biggest part of it in working with men. In working with boys, it's very, it's just the issues are different, but it's kind of a lot like working with girls in terms of how you approach it. I think in this day and age and this culture, boys have a kind of harder time of it in ways than girls these days in terms of the confusion about how to be and how am I supposed to be as, and so I'm just kind of like sensitive to that. But I think that, what else is specific to boys? I enjoy working with boys. I really do.
Do you find that as a female working with men and boys who experience sexual abuse, that kind of sometimes maybe is a barrier, or is it helpful? It depends on the situation. I mean, it depends on who is the abuser. If the boy was abused by a woman, same thing with a male. And then, it's kind of like how you use yourself in the room. First of all, being aware of that dynamic, that is going to bring up stuff, and then actually, you can use that material that comes up, and it may take longer
to develop a trusting relationship in that case, but also anger. If you were abused by a female, anger might come at me, and that's actually a good thing, because then I can work with that with somebody.
Do we have one more?
Yes, thank you both. My question is regarding, because of, there's always been a need there, I think, in that military population, veterans. And I don't just see commercials on the television or on the internet now. I feel like it's more accepted that to get help, to reach out, to get help, to talk about what PTSD issues, etc. And military sexual trauma as well. Do you see though an even higher rise because people are coming back?
I think they're doing a good job on trying to remove the stigma away, but like I said before, the stigma is very, very real if an individual is active duty. I've had veterans that have come to me because they were discharged because they got a diagnosis of PTSD, and not only are they dealing with their trauma now, but they're dealing with loss of their job, loss of a rank that they fought for and earned, and loss of a career path they were going on, so it adds to what they're going through. There is a lot of accessibility to our services. I know there's a crisis hotline now specifically for veterans, but as far as an increase of seeing veterans come in, we don't see it yet. Majority of the people utilizing our services remain being Vietnam veterans, and Vietnam veterans are the ones who actually played a huge role in RCS being created. And I don't know if you all know the history of Vietnam veterans, but they were very much put down when they first came home, and to this day still kind of feel that every now and then, and they come in and bring that into sessions. The OIF, the current war right now, that generation of service members are still trying to figure it out on their own. They're going to school, they're going, coming back to families, they want to go to work, they're figuring out what career they want. So they're kind of keeping themselves busy right now, but some of them are coming, they're trickling in, and the ones that are trickling in are the ones from the beginning of the war. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing an increase, but a lot of them are from like 2002, 2003, 2004, that time frame. But the recent returning veterans, you might get them to come in 2 or 3 sessions and they're like, I need to go to school. I got to get my life together. I haven't seen my child. I want to get to know. I'm not ready for this. Not yet. Mm-hmm. So we predict that outcome maybe in the next 10 years we'll see more of the OIF generation kind of outnumber the Vietnam veteran population.
Just a quick add-on question. You mentioned RCS. Mm-hmm. I live not that far from the Veteran Hospital in Brooklyn. Do you know of any other, I haven't started field placements because I'm extended programs, so we'll be starting in the fall. Uh-huh. Do you know of any other sort of internships off the top of your head that NYU may offer with regards to veterans or the population?
Well, RCS is within the VA. We don't work directly in the hospital. We're outpatient community centers. We distinguish ourselves from the VA to give them more privacy and confidentiality. This is something that's very unique to the VA because the VA hospital has communication with the Department of Defense. So if the veteran goes to the VA hospital for PTSD treatment and there's a diagnosis, the DOD can see it. Whereas if they come to us, no one else will see it but us. So that's what's make our program unique within the VA and why most veterans, combat veterans, want to come to RCS as opposed to the hospital. So it's called the Vet Center. Our program name is Readjustment Counseling Services, but there's a vet center in Brooklyn, there's a vet center in the Bronx, there's a vet center in Queens, and there's 2 vet centers in Manhattan. So they're everywhere. You're welcome.
One last one, if anyone has any burning questions. If not, you guys can give us a closing thought if you have something you want to add.